The year was 1281, and the greatest invasion force the world had ever seen lay anchored off the coast of Japan. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and ruler of the vast Mongol Empire, had assembled an armada that dwarfed anything previously witnessed in Asian waters. Over 4,000 ships carried approximately 140,000 troops, a combined force of Mongol cavalry, Chinese infantry, and Korean sailors. Their mission was straightforward: complete the subjugation of Japan that had failed 7 years earlier. But on a single August night, everything would change. In one of history's most audacious military operations, roughly 12,000 samurai would launch a desperate nocturnal raid that would shift the entire momentum of the war and ultimately save Japan from foreign conquest. The shadow of the first invasion. To understand the desperation and determination that drove the samurai's nighttime assault, we must first look back to 1274, when the Mongols made their initial attempt to conquer Japan. That first invasion had been a sobering experience for the Japanese warrior class. The samurai, trained in individual combat and bound by codes of honor that emphasized personal glory, had faced an enemy that fought with terrifying efficiency and unfamiliar tactics. The Mongol forces had landed on the beaches of Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu with approximately 23,000 to 40,000 troops. The samurai quickly discovered that their traditional methods of warfare were woefully inadequate against this new threat. Japanese warriors were accustomed to announcing themselves before battle, challenging worthy opponents to single combat, and fighting according to established protocols that had governed warfare among the feuding clans for centuries. The Mongols, by contrast, fought as coordinated units, using massed cavalry charges, disciplined infantry formations, and, most terrifyingly, explosive projectiles that the Japanese had never encountered. These early grenades, likely made from ceramic or iron shells filled with gunpowder, produced thunderous explosions that panicked horses and shattered the psychological resolve of warriors who had never experienced such weapons. The Mongol composite bows also outranged the Japanese weapons, allowing the invaders to rain arrows on the samurai before they could effectively respond. Mongol tactics emphasized overwhelming force applied at decisive points, group discipline over individual heroism, and the pragmatic pursuit of victory by any effective means. Despite these advantages, the first invasion had ultimately failed. The Mongols withdrew after a single day of fighting, though the reasons remain debated by historians. Traditional accounts speak of a storm that damaged the Mongol fleet and forced their retreat. Some modern scholars suggest that the invasion was merely a large-scale reconnaissance mission, while others argue that unexpectedly fierce Japanese resistance and the approach of nightfall led the Mongol commanders to re-embark their forces, after which weather conditions prevented a second landing attempt. Regardless of the exact reasons, the withdrawal gave Japan a 7-year reprieve, 7 years that the Japanese used with desperate purpose. Preparing for the storm. The Kamakura shogunate, which effectively ruled Japan under the nominal authority of the emperor, understood that the Mongols would return. Kublai Khan had already demonstrated his ambitions by conquering the Song dynasty in China and demanding submission from kingdoms throughout Asia. Japan's refusal to acknowledge Mongol supremacy made another invasion inevitable. The regent Hojo Tokimune, who led the shogunate, mobilized the nation's resources for the coming conflict. The most visible manifestation of this preparation was the construction of a massive stone wall along the beaches of Hakata Bay, where the Mongols had landed in 1274. This defensive barrier stretched for approximately 20 kilometers along the coastline, standing 2 to 3 meters high in most places. Built from stones gathered from throughout northern Kyushu and cemented with a primitive form of concrete, the wall was designed to prevent enemy forces from simply charging off their ships onto the beaches. But the physical preparations were only part of the equation. The samurai themselves had to adapt psychologically and tactically to face an enemy that played by different rules. The lessons of 1274 had been harsh, but educational. The warrior class began to understand that survival against the Mongols would require setting aside certain aristocratic notions of combat in favor of practical effectiveness. Unit cohesion, coordinated tactics, and the willingness to fight dishonorably when necessary became accepted aspects of the coming war. Religious institutions were also mobilized. Buddhist temples and Shinto shrines across Japan conducted prayers and rituals to invoke divine protection. The concept of kamikaze, divine wind, emerged from older legends of storms that had supposedly protected Japan in mythological times. Priests assured the warriors that the gods would not abandon Japan in its hour of need. This spiritual dimension gave the defenders a crucial psychological advantage. They were fighting not merely for their lands and lives, but for their very civilization and the favor of heaven itself. When Mongol envoys arrived in 1275, 1279, and 1280 demanding Japanese submission, Hojo Tokimune ordered them executed. A shocking violation of diplomatic norms that demonstrated Japan's absolute refusal to capitulate. The message was clear. There would be no peaceful resolution. War was inevitable, and Japan would face it on its own terms. The gathering storm. In the spring and early summer of 1281, reports began reaching Japan of massive military preparations on the Asian mainland. Kublai Khan had ordered the assembly of two enormous fleets. The Eastern Route Army, comprising approximately 40,000 to 50,000 troops, would sail from Korea. The far larger Southern Route Army, with nearly 100,000 soldiers, would depart from southern China. The plan called for these forces to rendezvous near Iki Island before launching a coordinated assault on Kyushu. The scale of this operation was unprecedented in world history up to that point. The logistics alone were staggering, provisioning 140,000 troops for an overseas campaign, constructing or requisitioning thousands of vessels, coordinating the movements of fleets setting out from points over 1,000 miles apart. If successful, the invasion would represent the culmination of Mongol military power and expand the empire to the shores of the Pacific. The Eastern Route Army arrived first, reaching the Japanese coast in early June. They quickly overran the islands of Tsushima and Iki, which lay between Korea and Kyushu. The defenders of these islands, though hopelessly outnumbered, fought with suicidal determination to buy time for the mainland to prepare. So Sukakuni, the commander of Tsushima, led approximately 80 samurai against the invading force. The entire garrison was annihilated, but their resistance delayed the Mongol advance by several crucial days. By late June, the Eastern Route Army had reached Hakata Bay. This time, however, they found the stone wall waiting for them. Unable to simply pour onto the beaches as they had in 1274, the Mongols were forced to remain primarily aboard their ships, launching limited raids but unable to establish a proper beachhead. The Japanese defenders, operating behind their fortifications with short supply lines to friendly territory, repelled these attacks with growing confidence. For several weeks, a strange stalemate developed. The Mongol fleet controlled the waters of Hakata Bay, but could not effectively engage the land-based Japanese forces. The samurai launched periodic raids, using small boats to approach the Mongol vessels at night, boarding them, and fighting brief but vicious engagements before withdrawing. These were probing attacks, testing the enemy's readiness and seeking vulnerabilities. The Mongol commanders grew increasingly frustrated. They were waiting for the Southern Route Army to arrive so they could launch a coordinated offensive with overwhelming numbers. But the Southern Route fleet was delayed, possibly by supply problems, possibly by the sheer difficulty of organizing such a massive armada. As June turned to July, The Eastern Route Army remained bottled up in Hakata Bay, taking casualties from Japanese raids while accomplishing little of strategic value. The night of desperate resolve. By early August, Japanese intelligence, gathered from interrogated prisoners and keen observation, indicated that the Southern Route Army was finally approaching. Once the two Mongol fleets combined, the invaders would have such overwhelming numerical superiority that even the stone wall might not save Kyushu. The Japanese commanders understood that they were running out of time. Something dramatic had to be done, and it had to be done soon. The decision was made to launch a massive nighttime raid against the Mongol fleet anchored in Hakata Bay. This was an extraordinarily risky proposition. Naval combat was not the samurai's strength. They were fundamentally land warriors. Moreover, boarding actions against a prepared enemy force occupying defensive positions aboard their own ships seemed nearly suicidal. The Mongols would have numerical superiority even in the area of attack, and if things went wrong, the raiders could be cut off from escape and annihilated. But the strategic logic was compelling. The Mongols had shown vulnerability to nighttime raids during the previous weeks of skirmishing. The invaders, uncertain of their position and lacking secure land bases, were psychologically on edge. A sufficiently large and aggressive attack under cover of darkness might create chaos disproportionate to its actual military strength. And crucially, such an attack would have to occur before the Southern Route Army arrived and made any offensive action by the Japanese virtually impossible. Approximately 12,000 samurai and supporting troops were assembled for the operation. These warriors came from various clans across Kyushu, united by the common cause of defending their homeland. They included some of the finest fighters Japan could field, experienced warriors who had survived the clashes of recent weeks and learned how to fight the Mongols effectively. Unlike the confused defenders of 1274, these men understood their enemy and had adapted their tactics accordingly. The plan was straightforward in concept, but challenging in execution. Using hundreds of small boats, the raiders would approach the Mongol fleet under cover of darkness. They would target multiple vessels simultaneously, spreading confusion and preventing the invaders from organizing an effective response. The objectives were not to sink ships or capture territory, but to kill Mongols, destroy supplies, and create maximum psychological impact. The samurai would strike hard, inflict as much damage as possible, and withdraw before the enemy could mount a coordinated counterattack. As night fell on August 15, 1281, the raiders began their approach. The date was significant. It was a moonless night, providing maximum concealment. The boats moved silently across the dark waters, guided by warriors who had spent recent weeks learning the positions and layouts of the enemy fleet. The Mongol watch was alert, but in the darkness, individual small boats were difficult to detect until they were nearly alongside the larger vessels. Chaos on the waters. The attack began nearly simultaneously across multiple points of the anchored fleet. The samurai came aboard the Mongol vessels like vengeful spirits emerging from the darkness, their swords gleaming in the light of suddenly kindled fires. The fighting was brutal and intimate, exactly the kind of close-quarters combat where the samurai's training and weapons gave them an advantage. The Mongol warriors, many of whom were sleeping or unprepared for immediate combat, struggled to respond to the sudden onslaught. The narrow confines of ship corridors and decks negated many of the tactical advantages that had served the Mongols well in open battle. Samurai swords, designed for quick, devastating cuts, were ideal weapons for fighting in tight spaces where their wielders could fully utilize their years of training. Fire became a crucial weapon. The Japanese raiders set blazes throughout the fleet, targeting supply ships and setting them ablaze to spread confusion and illuminate the battlefield to their advantage once the initial surprise was achieved. The wooden vessels, packed with provisions and munitions, burned readily. Flames leaped from ship to ship in some areas where the fleet was densely anchored, creating infernos that killed far more effectively than any sword. The Mongol response, when it finally came, was hampered by the very factors that had seemed like advantages. Their numbers meant that the fleet was densely packed in the bay, but this also meant that ships could not easily maneuver to support each other. Friendly fire in the darkness was a constant risk. Mongol archers couldn't shoot at the Japanese raiders without endangering their own troops. Command and control broke down as individual ship captains found themselves fighting isolated battles without clear intelligence about the overall situation. Some Mongol vessels managed to organize effective defenses. Soldiers who had kept their discipline formed shield walls on deck and repelled boarding attempts with massed archery and disciplined spear work. But these successes were local and temporary. The sheer scale and aggression of the Japanese attack meant that even successfully defended ships remained under threat, with fire spreading nearby and the sounds of combat echoing from all directions. For the samurai, the raid became a test not just of martial skill, but of courage and endurance. The original plan had called for hitting the fleet hard and withdrawing relatively quickly. But the unexpected success of the initial assault created opportunities too valuable to abandon immediately. Warriors who had expected to fight for an hour instead battled throughout the night, moving from ship to ship, seeking out Mongol commanders, slaying enemy soldiers, and spreading maximum destruction. Individual acts of heroism abounded. Historical accounts, though sometimes embellished in later retellings, speak of samurai leaders leaping between vessels, rallying their men for assaults on particularly important targets. Some warriors, wounded and knowing they couldn't escape, deliberately set fires that consumed themselves along with enemy supplies. Others held narrow choke points aboard captured vessels, allowing their comrades to complete their destructive work before withdrawing. The psychological impact may have been even more significant than the physical destruction. The Mongols, who had spent weeks essentially trapped aboard their ships, unable to properly engage the enemy on land, now found that even the supposed safety of their fleet was an illusion. The Japanese had struck at them in the heart of their own armada, had killed with impunity, and had withdrawn before dawn with acceptable casualties. The message was clear. Nowhere was safe, and the Japanese were willing to take extraordinary risks to resist the invasion. The wrath of heaven. As dawn broke on August 16, 1281, the Mongol fleet lay in disarray. Dozens of ships had been destroyed or severely damaged. Casualties numbered in the thousands. Supply vessels had been prioritized targets, and critical provisions had gone up in flames. The morale of the invading force, already strained by weeks of inconclusive skirmishing, had taken a severe blow. But the respite for the Japanese would be brief. Within days, the long-awaited Southern Route Army finally arrived. The combined Mongol fleet now numbered over 4,000 vessels carrying approximately 140,000 troops. Even accounting for the losses from the nighttime raid, the invaders still possessed overwhelming numerical superiority. The situation for the Japanese defenders remained desperate. The Mongol commanders decided to relocate the fleet to Takashima, a small island south of Hakata Bay, where they could regroup, reorganize, and prepare a final crushing assault. The combined fleet gathered in the waters around the island, and plans were made for a massive landing that would overcome Japanese resistance through sheer weight of numbers. Then, on August 15-16, just as the nighttime raid had occurred, though some sources place the typhoon a day or two later, the weather began to change. The sky darkened, winds increased, and a massive typhoon, one of the most powerful storms in recorded Japanese history, struck the Mongol fleet with catastrophic force. The typhoon raged for 2 days, Winds that may have exceeded 100 miles per hour drove mountainous waves across the anchorage. The Mongol vessels, many of them hastily constructed for the invasion and overcrowded with troops, proved woefully inadequate for such conditions. Ships were driven onto rocks, capsized by towering waves, or smashed together in the churning seas. Thousands of vessels were destroyed. The loss of life was staggering. Estimates vary widely, but modern historians generally agree that at least half of the invasion force perished. Perhaps 70,000 or more men drowned, crushed in wreckage, or dashed against the rocks. The Southern Route Army, which had just arrived and was entirely aboard ship when the storm hit, was virtually annihilated. The Eastern Route Army, though somewhat more dispersed, suffered comparable losses. Those Mongol and Chinese soldiers who managed to reach shore found themselves stranded on hostile territory, without supplies or hope of evacuation. Japanese forces systematically hunted down and killed these survivors over the following days and weeks. Some prisoners were taken, but mercy was rare. The invasion had failed catastrophically. The aftermath and legacy. The destruction of the Mongol fleet in 1281 marked the end of Kublai Khan's attempts to conquer Japan. The Khan would live until 1294, but he never again seriously threatened the Japanese archipelago. The logistical and human costs of assembling another invasion fleet of comparable size were simply too great, even for the vast resources of the Mongol Empire. Moreover, Kublai faced challenges elsewhere: rebellions, succession disputes, and the ongoing difficulties of governing the enormous territories he already controlled. For Japan, the victory became a defining moment in national consciousness. The concept of kamikaze, divine wind, evolved from a hopeful prayer into a confirmed historical reality. The storms that had destroyed the Mongol fleet were interpreted as clear evidence of divine favor, proof that Japan enjoyed special protection from the gods. This belief in special divine status would influence Japanese culture and military thinking for centuries, right up through World War II, when the term kamikaze would be repurposed for suicide pilots. The role of the nighttime raid in the larger narrative has sometimes been overshadowed by the dramatic typhoon, but its strategic importance cannot be overstated. The raid demonstrated that the Japanese were not simply waiting passively for divine intervention, but were actively fighting with intelligence, courage, and tactical innovation. The destruction inflicted that night weakened the Mongol force at a critical moment, degrading their supplies and morale just before the storm struck. More importantly, the raid bought time. Had the Mongol commanders been able to execute their planned assault immediately upon the Southern Route Army's arrival, they might have established a beachhead on Kyushu before the typhoon hit. Land-based forces would have survived the storm and could have continued the campaign. Instead, because the Japanese raids and the defensive wall had kept the Mongols bottled up at sea, virtually the entire invasion force remained vulnerable when the weather turned catastrophic. The samurai who participated in the nighttime raid became celebrated heroes. While individual names have sometimes been lost to history or obscured by legend, the collective achievement was remembered and honored. These warriors had demonstrated that courage and audacity could overcome seemingly impossible odds. They had shown that the samurai code, properly adapted to circumstances, remained relevant against the most sophisticated military machine of the age. Military innovation and adaptation. From a military history perspective, the events of 1281 offer valuable lessons about adaptation and innovation. The samurai's willingness to abandon certain traditional practices in favor of practical effectiveness made the difference between defeat and survival. The nocturnal raid itself was a significant departure from conventional samurai warfare, which typically occurred during daylight according to established rituals. The construction of the defensive wall demonstrated strategic thinking and logistical capability. This wasn't simply reactive defense, but rather a calculated effort to shape the battlefield to Japanese advantage. By denying the Mongols easy beach access, the defenders forced the invaders into a prolonged maritime siege for which they were ill-prepared. The intelligence gathering that preceded the nighttime raid showed sophisticated understanding of the need for reconnaissance. The Japanese had carefully observed the Mongol fleet's positions, routines, and vulnerabilities. This information enabled them to plan a coordinated attack across multiple targets, a level of operational planning that matched anything in medieval warfare. The psychological warfare dimension was also significant. The Japanese understood that they didn't need to destroy the entire Mongol fleet, an impossible task given the numerical disparity. Instead, they needed to create confusion, inflict casualties, and undermine enemy morale at a critical moment. The nighttime raid succeeded brilliantly in these objectives, proving that asymmetric tactics could partially offset conventional military inferiority. The Mongol perspective. Understanding the Japanese victory requires also examining the Mongol failures. The invasion force, despite its impressive size, suffered from significant weaknesses. Many of the vessels, particularly those in the Southern Route Army, had been hastily constructed and were not truly seaworthy for long ocean voyages. The Chinese shipwrights, working under pressure to meet Kublai Khan's ambitious deadlines, had cut corners on construction quality. The logistics of supplying 140,000 troops on an overseas campaign strained even the Mongol Empire's considerable capabilities. When Japanese raiders targeted supply vessels during the nighttime raid, they struck at a critical vulnerability. The invasion force had limited redundancy in their supply chain, and losses could not be easily replaced. The command structure also showed weaknesses. The Eastern Route Army and Southern Route Army operated semi-independently with insufficient coordination. The delay in the Southern Route Army's arrival left the Eastern force exposed and vulnerable for weeks. Better planning and communication might have enabled a more effective combined assault before the Japanese could complete their defensive preparations. Perhaps most fundamentally, the Mongols were attempting to project power across a significant body of water against a determined enemy fighting on their home territory. Naval logistics presented challenges that the primarily land-based Mongol military system was not optimally designed to handle. The empire's great strengths, cavalry mobility, combined arms coordination, and the ability to live off conquered territory, were largely negated by the maritime nature of the campaign. Conclusion. When heaven and heroes align. The destruction of the Mongol invasion in 1281 resulted from a combination of factors: Japanese military innovation and determination, Mongol logistical and tactical weaknesses, and the catastrophic intervention of natural forces in the form of the typhoon. To attribute the victory solely to the divine wind would diminish the courage and strategic acumen of the samurai defenders. To ignore the role of the storms would be to miss a crucial element of the historical reality. The nighttime raid by approximately 12,000 samurai represents one of the most audacious military operations of the medieval period. These warriors, facing an enemy that had conquered most of the known world, chose to attack rather than simply defend. They took the fight to the Mongol fleet in the most difficult possible conditions: at night, on the water, against numerically superior forces. Their success in inflicting significant damage while maintaining cohesion and achieving their objectives demonstrated martial excellence of the highest order. The raid's strategic impact extended beyond the immediate casualties and destruction. It degraded Mongol supplies at a critical juncture, undermined enemy morale, and demonstrated that the invaders were vulnerable even in what should have been safe anchorage. These effects made the invasion force more vulnerable when the typhoon struck days later, ensuring that the storm's destruction would be as complete as possible. In the broader sweep of history, the failed Mongol invasions of Japan marked the easternmost limit of the empire's expansion. Japan remained independent, its unique culture and institutions preserved from foreign conquest. The samurai class, vindicated by victory, would continue to dominate Japanese society for another 6 centuries, and the memory of the divine wind that saved Japan would become a permanent part of the national mythology, for better and worse. The story of those 12,000 warriors who rode into darkness to strike at an overwhelmingly superior enemy remains inspiring. It speaks to the power of courage, the importance of adaptation, and the reality that even the most daunting challenges can be met when intelligence, determination, and perhaps a measure of good fortune align. The Mongols learned that some islands cannot be conquered, no matter how mighty the invasion fleet. And the samurai proved that warriors willing to risk everything in defense of their homeland can achieve victories that seem impossible, one desperate night at a time.